He doesn't bring a single attack of his own. He doesn't have to. Every weapon in this room was written by the witness herself. Congressman Jamie Raskin opens with a compliment. He says he's moved by her words. She once wrote that if any political figure can aim federal law enforcement at its critics, the rule of law is dead.
If any political figure or party can direct federal law enforcement against its critics, we no longer live under the rule of law. Do you remember when you wrote that?
Yes, sir.
She wrote that a leader who clings to office against the will of his own voters can never claim to govern lawfully. Beautiful principles. Raskin agrees with every one of them.
I mean, I don't mean to embarrass you in any way, but I liked your statement of principle, and I'm wondering whether you're willing to interpret it in a completely obvious and objective way.
And then he does the one thing she didn't expect. He asks her to apply them to the prosecution orders against Comey, against Letitia James, against Adam Schiff, to the man who told 60 courts he won, lost every time, and told his supporters to march anyway. Watch her reach for every exit. If there's evidence, without all the facts, that's not what I meant. As Raskin closes them one by one, until he asks the question she simply cannot answer. Let's get into it.
Raskin, the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And Ms. D'Andrea, I'm moved by some of your political statements. One of the things you said at the end of last year was, if any political figure or party can direct federal law enforcement against its critics, we no longer live under the rule of law. Do you remember when you wrote that?
Yes, sir.
So do you reject Donald Trump's very public orders to the Department of Justice and the FBI to investigate and prosecute James Comey, Letitia James, Adam Schiff, a bunch of other colleagues, including Jason Crow?
I would say if there's reason and there's evidence to investigate those people, then he's absolutely right to call for it. If not, then he doesn't need to call for that.
Wait, you said if any political figure can direct federal law enforcement against its critics, we no longer live under the rule of law.
I think there's a difference between someone being critical and someone doing something that violates the rule of law.
Okay, but all of it, I mean, the reason why all the grand juries refused to render indictments, the reason why a number of prosecutors resigned or were forced out of their positions were because of the obvious point that Donald Trump is attacking them because he perceives them to be political critics or adversaries of his. And so it would seem to me, just to apply your rule to the facts of the situation, Donald Trump is absolutely taking us outside of the rule of law. I mean, I don't mean to embarrass you in any way, but I liked your statement of principle, and I'm wondering whether you're willing to interpret it in a completely obvious and objective way.
I would say that my interpretation is objective, and I think that without having all the facts about each of these individuals and each of the allegations allegedly, against them, I can't speak generally to the president's statements. I stick by my original statement.
If any president, whether it was Maduro or Trump or Oscar Orlando Hernandez, says, I want you to go and investigate and prosecute these 20 political enemies of mine, your position would basically be agnostic. Well, let's wait and see what happens in the investigation. Is that right? Doesn't that defeat the whole point of your statement?
Respectfully, that's not right. That's not what I mean. That's not what I intended to say.
All right, well, let me ask about another one. I wish we had all day, because you've said some interesting things, which I agree with at the level of generality at which you stated them. For example, you said that Maduro had refused to cede power. I think it was in the 2024 election, and you said that it's impossible to sustain a claim to lawful governance by a leader who holds office in defiance of his own electorate. Well, that really made me think about what happened in 2020, when Donald Trump claimed that he won the election, but the Congress found that he had not won the election. 60 federal and state courts rejected every claim of electoral fraud and corruption. But not only did he claim that he won it, he continues to claim that he won it. So I hope you would repudiate that.
Thank you for the question. I would say that he ceded power. He gave in. The President Biden was sworn in and was the president of the United States, so he did not illegally hold on to power in the manner that President Maduro, illegitimate dictator, did.
Oh, I see. In other words, because the coup didn't work and the violent insurrection didn't succeed in overturning the election, then you think it was all right what he did.
Respectfully, that's not what I said.
I said that's what I said, though. In other words, you seem to be saying that because his attempt to destroy Joe Biden's electoral college majority, which he won by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the electoral college, because his efforts to overturn that on the floor of Congress and with a violent insurrection, then he complied with what you were stating as a basic rule of law principle.
Respectfully, sir, I think there's a difference between asking whether fraud occurred and refusing to cede power once it's been made clear to you that it hasn't.
Well, what's inciting a violent insurrection against your own government?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Well, you're saying there's one thing about asking a question, for example, going to 60 different federal and state courts to try to get a ruling, but once you've lost all of those, you think it's legitimate within the rule of law and democracy to incite a violent insurrection, as Donald Trump was impeached for?
Sure, I appreciate the question. I don't have a clear answer for you on that.
Okay.
I think the evidence...
Well, we can discuss it later. And I thank you for your statement of principles, which I think are often quite lucid, but I wish that you would apply them even-handedly across the board. It might be tough from the job that you're in right now. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
What makes this exchange so effective is that Raskin never introduces an argument of his own. He simply hands the witness her own words and asks her to live by them, turning the whole hearing into a test of intellectual consistency. He opens by quoting a principle she wrote at the end of last year that if any political figure can aim federal law enforcement at its critics, the country no longer lives under the rule of law. It is a clean, absolute statement, and Raskin's tactic is to treat it as a rule rather than a slogan, then walk it straight into the present by naming Trump's public demands that the Justice Department and FBI investigate figures like James Comey, Letitia James, Adam Schiff, and Jason Crow. The trap is airtight on its face because the witness either has to say her own principle condemns those orders or she has to carve out an exception. And the moment she carves out an exception, she undermines the very rule that made her sound principled in the first place. Her escape is the qualifier, if there's reason and there's evidence, which is a reasonable sounding standard. But Raskin pounces on the gap, pointing out that grand juries refused to indict and that prosecutors resigned or were pushed out, evidence in his telling that the targets were chosen for being adversaries rather than for any crime. The witness's defense, which is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, is essentially a demand for particularity. She insists her interpretation is objective and that, without knowing the specific facts and allegations against each individual, she cannot pronounce judgment on the president's statements in the abstract. This is a defensible lawyerly posture, the idea that you do not declare a prosecution illegitimate until you have examined its actual basis, and in a different setting, it would be unremarkable. But Raskin's counter exposes the cost of that posture because he reframes it as agnosticism, asking whether, if any leader, Maduro or Trump or Juan Orlando Hernandez, ordered the investigation of 20 named political enemies, her answer would simply be to wait and see how the investigations turn out. Put that way, the case-by-case standard starts to look like it could never actually trigger her own principle, since one can always claim to be awaiting the facts. She pushes back hard that this is not what she meant, and the genuine tension here is real and not merely partisan. The difference between a bright-line rule against weaponizing law enforcement and a fact-dependent rule that only condemns prosecutions proven baseless after the fact. Raskin then pivots to a second principle from her writings, which sharpens the same blade, her statement that a leader who holds office in defiance of his own electorate cannot sustain a claim to lawful governance, written about Maduro refusing to cede power after the 2024 election. He maps it directly onto 2020, reciting that Trump claimed victory, that Congress certified he had lost, and that some 60 federal and state courts rejected every fraud claim, yet he continued to insist he won. Here, the witness offers her most substantive distinction, that Trump ultimately did cede power, that Biden was sworn in, and that this is categorically different from Maduro clinging to office as what she calls an illegitimate dictator. On the narrow point, she has a logical foothold, because the formal transfer of power did occur, and a principle about a leader physically refusing to leave does not perfectly fit a leader who left while protesting. Raskin, however, refuses to let the distinction rest on outcome, recasting it with a pointed line, that she is effectively saying it was acceptable because the coup did not work and the insurrection did not succeed. His move is to attack the idea that an attempt should be judged by whether it failed, listing Biden's margin of more than 7 million votes and the 306 to 232 Electoral College result to underline that the effort to overturn it had no factual basis. The climax arrives when Raskin compresses the entire disagreement into a single unanswerable question, asking what inciting a violent insurrection against your own government actually is, if not a violation of the rule of law she claims to defend. The witness's reply, that she is not sure she understands the question, and then that she does not have a clear answer, is the moment the consistency trap fully closes, because a witness who can fluently articulate principles about lawful governance suddenly cannot say whether inciting an insurrection breaches them. Raskin's distinction does the work for her, separating the legitimate act of going to 60 courts to contest an election from the illegitimate act of inciting violence after losing all of them, and her inability to follow her own logic to that conclusion is the entire point of the segment. He closes not with a gotcha, but with something more cutting precisely because it is gentle, praising her principles as lucid while wishing she would apply them even-handedly, and adding that this might be hard given the job she is in. That final line names the real subtext, the suggestion that her selective reading is not a failure of intellect, but a product of the position she is seeking or holds. It is worth noting that this is one side prosecuting a case, that the witness's particularity defense has genuine legal logic, and that the framing of these events is itself politically contested, but as a piece of cross-examination, the power lies in Raskin forcing a choice between a principle and a person and letting the silence answer.